Hello and welcome to the Tipsy Theory podcast. My name is Adrian.
And I'm Allysha.
And today we are going to do another installment of Debate Date. This one about a subject that is dear to both of our hearts and something that Allysha particularly is very passionate about. So Allysha, why don't you tell us what we're going to talk about today?
Well, I say that we're both passionate about it, just in different ways.
Which is why this debate date should be a little bit more
interesting
than usual.
So we have decided to talk about the very touchy subject of Doug Ford's cuts to education, more specifically to OSAP and university education, because there has also been a lot of cuts to high school, but we kind of wanted to limit the conversation.
Yes. So something that has been very, 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 very controversial in this province as of late. But before we dive into that, let's just take a moment to get some stuff cleared out of the way, such as our drink. For this episode, we are drinking a beer called Land Shark.
Because I'm a land shark.
That is a meme.
Yeah, I'm a land shark.
That I do not understand the reference to fully.
Jenna Marbles. If you just YouTube land shark Jenna Marbles, it will bring you back to middle school if you were born in the 1990s. But
it's actually very good. I found it in the back of the LCBO.
Yeah, it's not bad. It has a good label too. It's like all pretty and yellow, and it says fins up on the back.
Does
very clever.
If you're familiar with a beer called Red Stripe, I would equate it to that in taste. It's a very island beer. I think it's because it's probably made with sugarcane.
It's also brewed by Margaritaville International Brewing Company.
Wasting away again in Margaritaville.
It's actually not bad. It's very light. Very good.
Some people say that there's a woman to blame.
People aren't listening to this to hear you sing.
But I know.
No.
It's my own damn fault.
Anyways.
All right. And today's sponsor is, of course, Groundhog.io, marketing automation for WordPress. Groundhog with 2 Gs, and we will talk about more about that sponsor at the end of this podcast. But why don't you set up the pre-frame for what we're going to be talking about today?
All right. Well, set it up how? Just like go for
give us and the listeners some context if they've been living under a rock for the last little while.
My best non-opinionated views on this quickly before I get opinionated. That's going to be hard. Okay, so if you don't already know, Doug Ford is the Donald Trump of Canada.
Debatable, but go on.
I'm doing really good at the non-biased already, right? Yeah, anyway, so Doug Ford is our Premier of Ontario.
He is the Premier.
Yep, and he has made a bunch of cuts recently through his platform to get Ontario out of debt, essentially, is what he's trying to do.
A very large debt.
Yes. And through these cuts, he's made an attack. Well, not an attack, but he's made a move to cut. I'm trying to be unbiased. He's made a move to cut off money towards the university systems in Ontario.
Primarily OSAP.
Yes. Well, not just that. So, first off, without OSAP, he made a policy that universities for Ontario have to limit their tuition by 10%.
Yes. So the first change that was implemented, and we're not talking about whether this is good or not yet.
No.
But the first change that was implemented is that across the board, all tuition is reduced by 10% across the board, regardless of
university
any
and
university
college.
Program, college, just across the board, 10% less.
Yes. And on top of that, he also made a lot of OSAP changes. And if you aren't aware, OSAP is a loan that students get when they want to study.
Well, OSAP is an organization that provides loans. If we're going to be super specific,
provides loans and grants.
So and I actually have. I'm not sure if you do, but I have the full list of changes.
So do I.
Do you? All right.
Yeah.
Why don't you go through that full list of changes then?
All right. Well, first off, OSAP provides loans and grants depending on your social income for your family income. So the first change that was made is that students will now. Well, this is also not really OSAP either. This is also more of the tuition fees. But students will be able to opt out of non-essential fees in the future.
Yeah, all right.
No bias yet.
No bias yet.
And this
includes
includes things such as like campus activities.
Student unions.
Newspapers.
Job fairs.
Stuff like that. Clubs. Everything.
Club funding.
Yeah. And now more into the OSAP. So I'm just going to read off this list here. Students will now be charged interest on the provincial portion of their OSAP loans immediately after after graduation.
So that is the removal of a 6-month interest-free grace period.
Yes, before you had 6 months to be able to find a job, start saving, before you started paying interest.
This change is, should be important to note, not retroactive. So it is only affecting new OSAP grants, not anybody that were agreed to or signed upon pre-2019.
And to make it clear, because this is a lot of confusion, they took away the 6-month grace period, but that does not mean you need to start paying full payment. So you still get 6 months before you start paying like $500 a month, whatever your budget plan is. But they will be charging you interest on your loan fees for those 6 months still.
Loans, payments don't need to start right away,
No.
obviously with any loan, but obviously the longer you wait to start making payments, the more interest you incur.
Yes, so you still have the 6-month grace period to pay your loans, but not for the interest. So another thing that they've done, do you want to read off another one so that we're kind of sharing this?
Sure. So, free tuition has been eliminated entirely. So low-income students used to be able to apply for free tuition, not for a very long time, though, as that change was actually introduced relatively late into the Kathleen Wynne government. But that has now been eliminated, although it was only here for about maybe a year at most anyway. But essentially what has happened is that's been eliminated, but the amount of allocations for grants among the low-income bracket has been elevated in distribution. However, more kind of like level across the board. So I have this actual numbers here.
I have the numbers here too.
Yeah. So it's been increased. So the actual number of grants that low-income students can receive has been increased from 69% to 72%.
I have 82 here.
You have 82%?
Where are you?
I'm on westerngazette.ca.
I'm on CTV, so.
Okay, so what are your numbers?
I have 82%.
You have 82%.
Yeah.
So they've been increased to 82%. However, that does not mean that students necessarily receive more grants. However, more students can receive lower grants is what that means.
Yes. And I also have some numbers here too. So before, your family income is very inclusive. No matter whether or not you're with your family, if your family actually has the money, they go off what your family makes. So now students who have a family income of more than $140,000 or above will not be able to receive any loans from the government.
Exactly. So to recap, essentially what this change means is now if there's a pool of 100 students, previously maybe 20 of those students would receive free tuition, but now with this change, 50 students out of those 100 will receive half of their tuition.
Yes.
If that makes sense.
And another change that I kind of want to bring up, it doesn't fully affect like undergrad students, but it affects what is it called? Postgrad?
Yeah.
Postgrad students. So for anybody who is studying in second entry programs, which is postgrad, such as postgrad college, graduate degrees, law programs, etc., the Ontario government has changed the grant to loan ratio so that no Ontario student will receive more grants than loans.
Yes, so that means that at minimum you will always be paying at least half of your tuition. There are no longer any free rides.
Well, I wouldn't classify it as a free ride, but okay.
Well, no free tuition anyway.
So I think that's most of it. Most of the hard facts.
Yeah, there's a few other ones I've heard. They've made a change to something called an independent student.
Oh yes, that's a good one too.
So the independent student used to be classified as anyone who was out of school, high school rather, for 4 years.
And to classify that means that they wouldn't take into account your family parental
That means
income.
they wouldn't take into account your family parental status or income, but that has been extended from 4 to 6 years, which means your family income will be also taken into account if you're applying for post-secondary, not post-secondary, but master's degrees and so on, if you're applying for OSAP for those changes. So now your family income can be taken into account for that.
That's a good place to start with this conversation.
So independent students, now 6 years out of high school. Are there any other?
I think that's the main ones.
Oh, another big one. So for grants and for low-income, or not low-income students, but for grants, household incomes of $140,000 or more will now be completely illegible.
I
Uneligible.
literally said that already.
Did you say that?
Yeah.
Oh, I missed that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, you miss everything I say. It's fine.
Okay. All right. So I think we have enough information about these changes to maybe head in for. So what would you like to start with?
So where do you want to start? I think starting off.
Well, I think let's pre-frame. So I happen, while not great, I happen to not necessarily be totally outraged that these changes have been made. I understand why they made them, and I would actually support the government in pursuing these changes. While Allysha, on the other hand,
I think it's also important to note that we both were university students at one point.
Both of us were.
We both went to the University of Toronto. I went for 4 years. I got my bachelor's.
I went for 3 and dropped out.
Yes, I used OSAP while I was in school.
I did not.
Adrian did not. So
I was fortunate that I did not have to.
Adrian was fortunate that he was able to find a cheap place to live and tuition costs were covered. So you were lucky in that aspect.
I was.
I was not. So there are different retrospects. Like, we're coming from different angles. I think the reason why I'm so passionate about this, if you already can't tell, I'm on the opposing end, is because
She believes no changes should have been made.
I went through school because of OSAP. That's how I got to where I was. I went to the big school, the Ivy League of Canada, because of OSAP, which I don't think I would have been able to do without OSAP. So that's kind of my stance on it, opposed to yours. So that's important to know. But I think we can talk about the independent change, because that's interesting.
All right. Why don't you start us off there?
Okay. Well, I personally think that it's stupid that you can't disassociate yourself from your family to begin with.
Why is that?
Because the fact that you now have to wait 6 years before your parents' income isn't considered is frankly not fair, because a lot of people their parents don't pay their tuition. Their parents' income has nothing to do with them and how they're paying for their tuition outside of school. You know what I mean? Like, if you're going to take the parents' finances into account, why not charge the loans to the parents, not the student?
Fair enough. In response to that, I believe I would say that in today's millennial economy, many of us, including both you and myself, are very attached to the finance line of our parents, and I think it would be.
That's not true, but okay.
I think it's reasonable to expect that, with the large expense of obviously paying off OSAP loans and going to university and living in your own place, that we, in many cases, we would be receiving financial aid from the upper tiers, as it were.
But it's not fair to expect that.
No, I agree, but maybe that what could have been done is instead put it on a per case basis. And I'm sure there are exceptions and exclusions that you can apply for in the event that, for example, and anybody, for example, if you were someone who was not receiving financial aid from your parents, then you would technically, in most cases, you're probably already in a low-income situation, and therefore the rest of the benefits that are applied to low-income families would be applied anyway.
I have a story. Do you want to hear my story?
All right, let's hear an anecdotal story.
Okay. Well, I'm obviously not going to name names here because that's not fair, but I did have a friend back in Guelph. And his parents, his mom was a teacher, I believe, and his dad was a lawyer. And they made over bracket. They were raking in money. But the father had a gambling problem. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't have any extra money to their name. They couldn't afford to put him through school, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with your parents not being able to afford to put you through school. But because his income bracket was so high, the OSAP wouldn't give him anything. No loans, no grants, no nothing. And he was forced to try and find a different way to pay to go to school. He just wanted to go to his local school. He didn't want to go out, didn't want to move.
U of G?
Yeah. He just wanted to get the tuition covered, just to get a loan for it. And he ended up trying to get loans from banks, etc., but he didn't have a credit card, and his parents, he didn't have a credit score, which is, his fault. And his parents' credit score was, off the charts. So they weren't able to get a loan for him. So we had to go to one of those, what are they called, loan bureau things?
Ugh.
To pay for his education.
That's unfortunate.
And
payday loans were.
Yeah, it wasn't a payday, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, 22%.
Yeah, just so he could afford to go to his first semester of school.
Oof.
And I honestly think that that's a prime example of why your parents shouldn't be considered in your. I get that it does have a factor, especially when your parents can afford to pay for it, but
At the same time, while that is, obviously a distressing story and no one wants to be in that situation, the question becomes: is it the government's responsibility in order to take into account those situations, or merely kind of like a majority rule situation where they have to come up with situations that fit most situations, but not necessarily all situations?
To be fair, though, I just think that if you want to be disassociated from your family, you should.
Well, I think that there's not necessarily a difficult problem. Although you'd have to prove that you would not be receiving financial aid in any way, shape, or form from that lifeline. Like how would you go about proving that? Right? You'd have to provide, I guess, your parents' credit scores or something.
I guess
There'd have to be like an actual, because in that case anybody would be able to, regardless of any financial aid that they were receiving from their parents, be able to essentially tick a box or a checkbox on a form somewhere and be, I'm not associated, and therefore reap the rewards of someone from a low income family would be receiving, where it might as well be more applicable to a low income family than it would be to someone who simply wanted kind of half of their tuition paid and save some money. Does that make sense?
That makes sense, but the thing is, if they were so focused on low-income people, they wouldn't have cut that too.
It's not necessarily. I would classify it more as a redistribution.
I see what you're saying, but at the same time, like, it's making it impossible for people to follow their dreams.
Maybe. So.
Okay, wait. Before we get into this, do you want to talk about the less sensitive topic? Because this is going to turn into a debate of the cut-in of, like, the choice for students to not have to pay for, like, clubs and newspapers and unions.
Well, that I think that's just an ace in the hole. That was a brilliant idea. I think that's a brilliant piece of legislation, because $2,000 on my tuition went to services that I never even knew existed or had heard of.
If you looked at the University of Toronto invoice bills, you were paying, what was it? I think like $40 a semester to Hart House Theater, like the Hart House community, which nobody had anything to do with.
I had to pay extra for the band too.
Yeah.
That wasn't even included. In order to join the band, I had to pay extra on top of that.
Yeah.
So, and trust me, the jazz ensemble wasn't receiving any funding. So
it's just like you paid for unions. I had to pay for, because the University of Toronto, if you didn't know, is split into colleges, kind of like Harry Potter.
There are 8 of 9. I don't know.
But you had to pay.
I was in New College.
You had to pay your college fees. You had to pay your student union college fees. You had to pay gym fees for gym memberships, which I never used.
No.
Like, it would have been nice to be able to opt out of those things.
I told you paid for, I think, $40 to use the dental plan.
That I never. But
that was only applied to the dentist, which was across the street.
I'm gonna stop you there though, because you can opt out of healthcare already.
Okay, and you?
Yes.
Oh well.
Healthcare is something you can opt out of, at least for the University of Toronto right now. But everything else,
I stand corrected,
was compulsory. You couldn't opt out of these student fees. And
the student union is just a money hole.
It is.
No one knows where that money goes. Like, if you look at over at the
Ryerson's
campus, and like the $450,000 in like Airbnb
that was charged to the union credit card from the president.
Ridiculous.
Yeah. So, but at the same time, I do
timely too for that. Actually, I'll go down just after these changes. Look, scandal.
So what happened was the Ryerson University president of the student union took out a bunch of money for like Airbnbs for parties and stuff. And Doug Ford used it as an example as to why he wanted to make these changes.
Call it opportunistic if you might, but he ain't wrong.
No, but you have to also look at the negatives to this. You have to play devil's advocate, Like, this is going to limit so many of the unions that already exist.
But it may limit them from existing, but if nobody paid attention or used them at the beginning, is that such a terrible thing?
Well, no, the thing is, there are people that were part of these unions and part of these clubs. That's why they exist.
Yeah, but the whole point of the student union was to represent the student body and represent the interests. But the interests of students is to pass courses and, join the things that they enjoy, not necessarily shove a whole bunch of money to run elections, pay for elections, and necessarily argue about issues that nobody's interested in.
You're also paying for clubs, You're paying for those club fees. You're paying for.
If you want to pay for the club fees, then you should join the clubs that you want, and those clubs can have their individual fees and collect the monies from the club members. That's how actual clubs work out in like real life.
Well, one thing that's also, I don't disagree with you there, but one thing that's also important to note is I was reading this article as well, and like, they use student fees for stuff like the, what are they called? Like the walk home alone at night,
Yeah, so those programs, I don't. Are those programs compulsory or because
No, you can opt out of everything that isn't tuition.
everything that is
So if
tuition.
you're not paying for like, for example, the sex houses, like the
Right.
sex information, like the free condoms, the stuff like that, like mental health awareness, stuff like that, all of those are also cut. So if you as a student, which for me personally, like you think about yourself as a student, you're already paying so much money that if I'm like, I can save $2,000 in my tuition, I'm going to, I'm going to completely cut them out. But then you have to think about like all of a sudden there's like no more free condoms.
At what point though does social responsibility on part of the actual organization, on part of the university, kick in, where they start footing the bill for these kind of things? Because we already pay like tons in tuition, and most of that money doesn't go to the professors.
I mean, professors are making bank though.
They are, but if you were to take, if you're looking at maybe $10,000 a student in a room of a lecture full of 2,000 people, I can guarantee you all that money ain't going to a professor.
No.
And it certainly ain't going to schools paying taxes. So it's going somewhere. So what point does social responsibility on behalf of the university step in to actually say, all right, it's time for us to foot the bill instead of passing off that price on to low-income students who no longer can pay full tuition price on behalf of the government?
I honestly don't think they will. Like, if you think about it, universities, they're a private business.
They are. They're not.
They're not
universities
here.
do not exist to benefit. That's a different debate, maybe. But universities do not exist to benefit the student. They exist to create value for shareholders.
Like, as much as education is important, and students at this point are roped into needing university degrees, the university itself does not care about students. So unless it becomes like mandatory or there's a lot of like, social pressure, which they're not going to cave to it. They don't care. As long as they're getting their money, they're not going to spend money on things that students can pay for. They're going to be like, hey, listen, you want sexual assault classes? You want like prevention? You want like walk-a-buddy programs? Cool, pay for it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, unless it gets passed by like a legislation, like they're not going to do it.
So that there are two sides to every coin. I don't believe that it should be factored into the tuition. I don't think kind of like essential services need be factored into the tuition fee.
Essential services as in?
Well, I guess you could classify as the night walks as an essential service.
Could you though? Like, that's the thing. Like, you can twist it. You can be like, students don't need free condoms. They can buy their own condoms. Then all of a sudden there's like a gonorrhea outbreak in the U of T. Like...
Two sides to every coin. I think as a whole the change is a good one. While losing those programs would certainly not be in the best interest of many people, I think it is in the best interest of kind of the whole as a general rule, because it does say if we're purely looking at the financial burden that it puts on, or the extra financial burden that it puts on to students, $2,000 can be the difference between make it or break it.
No, absolutely, and I do agree. And the thing is that's really sad about it is I think the main unions and clubs aren't going to suffer, because if you look at it, where are all of the alumni going? They're going to fund like the newspaper, the football team, the student union, because that's what they're believing. They're not going to fund like the mental health program,
which I think is the real tragedy, because those portions don't necessarily yield the best benefit.
No, absolutely not. But
So I think we're both in agreement on that one point.
A little bit.
But I think it was a stellar change, but
I think it could have been handled a little bit differently. But it is a good way that students should be able to opt out of some fees, because some of them are ridiculous, for sure. Like, I remember looking through my invoice first year being like, why am I paying for all of these things that I don't need to pay for? Especially when I was taking on OSAP loans, like... You don't want to rack up those loans because you're going to be paying them off. And if half of those loans are for fees that you don't need, it's really heartbreaking as a student.
Let's talk about the big one. So to recap so far, we've covered that the cuts or that the change that students can now opt out of student union fees and so on and so forth is a good change.
For the most part.
The change of independent student, I believe that it is in the best interest of the government.
I disagree
as
with
far
that.
as saving money goes, is a good
not
change.
In the interest of the student.
Not necessarily in the interest of the student, but in the interest of the government, it is definitely a beneficial change.
Yeah, but the government doesn't. They can take cuts out from somewhere else. Like.
Well, OSAP is one of the biggest funded, is one of the top 3 funded programs in this province.
Doug Ford's slogan is that we're now open for business. And you limiting access for education to students to prosper and make businesses is very counterintuitive.
Which brings us into the main topic: is are the main changes? So the changes to low income housing, low income students, and students under $140,000, are those justified?
So just a kind of small recap is like no matter where you are, you're getting less grants now than you were previously.
Yes. So at most, you can only get up to 50% of your tuition paid for by the government in grant money. The rest is a loan, which will incur interest, which you will have to pay back.
And it will start incurring
unless
interest.
The Liberals write it off. But
as soon as you graduate. So you have absolutely no chance. Like that's, I think, the part that makes me the most peeved about this. Is that the government is going and they're being like, hey, like, just to let you know, we're not giving you as many grants anymore. You're going to have to pay back way more loans. But, you know, to make it less confusing for you, we're going to start charging interest right away.
So I'm going to take this from a business or as a capitalist perspective. The change overall, so I'm looking specifically right now at the elimination of free tuition and increase of shared funds and grants allocated to low-income students. So at the moment, they've increased the pool, as you said, to 82% of that's total available grant money. However, at most, low-income students can only get up to $50,000. So that allows at least the opportunity for more low-income students to go to university. Yes, they still have to pay half of it back. As a business decision, looking at that is way more money that you can expect to receive in receivables, therefore turning OSAP into a potentially more profitable situation than it was before. That way, we are turning potential loans or grants that we have received zero money back on. We are now looking at something that will actually generate revenue for the province, which I think is why they actually made that decision. So that way, more people will have at least the
everything you're saying is wrong.
Well, you'll have your turn. I'm not done yet. But you'll have your turn. So more students will have the ability to go to school and at least have half of it paid off, therefore generating more revenue for the province based on the interest of the other half of the loan. And now, Allysha, you can have your turn.
Are you ready? Are you done?
Okay, yes.
Are you done?
Yeah.
More students will not have the opportunity to go to school. That statement is completely and utterly false. Because what they're doing by limiting the amount of grants, they're also limiting the amount of loans. So you cap out eventually. Like, they don't just give you as much loans as you want. They give you a certain amount of loans and you cap out. So I'm going to use me as an example because even with free tuition, I capped out. I went to res first year, which, yes, you can argue you didn't need to do. That is fair. But, you know, like I came from a different city, came hours away, and I lived in res for first year. But residence is crazy expensive down here.
Which it doesn't necessarily need to be, which is a fault of the university.
That is also true, but, you know.
Also, the mandatory meal plans are also irrelevant and not necessary. So that is also that is something that you could pass off on the responsibility of the university.
You can say that all you want, but the universities aren't going to change it. And if Ontario wants to open for business, they need to accept this, or they need to pass laws for these universities, not take it on the students.
Story is what you were doing.
But I totally just bottomed out the mic there because I'm so angry. I ended up bottoming out my loans. So first year, I got my loans and grants. This is when free tuition was a thing as well. So I got not fully free tuition, but, you know, you got some grant money, you got some loan money. But I was still $5,000 short to go to school for my first year. And you can't just pull $5,000 out of your ass. Like, that doesn't work. So you can say that, sure, they're going to make these grants more, they're going to disperse them to more people. But if they do that, just because you can get these grants and loans doesn't mean that you can actually afford to go to school. They can be like, yeah, I'm going to give you like $8,000, but you actually need 12.
Point taken. On the same token, though, you don't necessarily need to spend, if you are actually extremely dedicated to pursuing the degree that you want, you don't necessarily have to fork $12,000 over a year per tuition all at once. While you can part it out and take it over a course of maybe 8 years instead of 4 years by doing school part-time, which is actually, I did school part-time, although I didn't need to in order to afford it, but that's what I did.
But the thing is you do school part-time, you work part-time.
Absolutely.
You need to pay for your groceries, for your rent, for your tuition still. You don't have much money to save to pay for it doesn't, you're still short cash on that way. Like, you need to work full-time to live in the city. It's impossible not to, especially down here. Like, I understand the circumstances are different in other cities, but if you live in one of the big cities where a lot of the universities are, like Ottawa, Montreal's in Quebec, but Ottawa, Toronto, a lot of them are in like Waterloo. Like, those are all still big cities with big rents. And if you need to work part-time and school part-time, you're still going to be short on cash. And you only get part-time OSAP.
Well, I'm going to use you as an example. We do have 4 months in the summer as well that we can work part-time, which is what you did in order to...
some people take, if you're in certain science programs, you need to take summer school internships and stuff like that, which don't pay. That depends on your program.
That may be true, but again, focusing as a general rule rather than on exceptions.
It's not exceptions. Most science kids have to do summers.
I'm not aware of this requirement. Do you have...
David has to do summers. Lindsay has to do summers. So my cousin is in science here in U of T, and he's doing an internship this summer with no pay. Somebody else I know is at the University of Guelph, and they're in speech pathology, and they have to do co-ops in the summer. So
paid or unpaid?
She gets paid, but she gets paid like part-time hours. So
living expenses are also less in Guelph than they are here.
Really, they're still rent's expensive. Mm-hmm. Rent's like $900 a month for 1 bedroom.
Is that in a shared or by yourself?
Like 1 bedrooms apartments that go for like $9,000.
Right.
Unlike the cheaper ones, so it's still pricey.
I agree. I think you're also factoring in a certain level of expected quality of life as well. Because as a student, you can live relatively inexpensively if you do the studenting right. My room during university was $700 a month in a shared building with 14 other men. And that's how I lived. I lived relatively inexpensively, I think, and I did studenting right. And I think that given the tenacity of many students, they'd be able to find themselves in situations where they could live rather inexpensively. And of course, that's not a desired...
$700 a month isn't inexpensively.
In Toronto, it is.
I paid $700 a month for my apartment, too, and I was barely getting by with OSAP money. And I worked.
But you did get by.
Barely. And now they're limited in that amount of money.
But you did.
With the old OSAP.
With the old OSAP.
Not the new one.
I think that I don't believe it is the responsibility of the government in order to make the situation level.
I absolutely believe it's the responsibility of the government, especially one who claims they want to make Ontario prosper with business, to give rights to people who want their education.
Because if you want something badly enough, you will figure out a way to get it.
That's not true.
I disagree.
You can disagree all you want, but if you're short like 10 grand, you can't just pull that out of your ass or go to your family and be like, hey, give me 10 grand. People don't have that benefit.
Well, then it might just take longer than you don't necessarily have to go spend it all at once and do the program in 4 years like some people who may be more fortunate. But you can take the time that it takes and work the rest of the time in order to be able to do it.
What Doug Ford's government is doing is it's benefiting the rich and like basically just throwing out the poor.
Well, the rich don't get OSAP either.
No, but the poor don't either.
That's not true. The
they
low
get
income,
way less than they used to.
They get less per person, but more in general. So that means that if you are at the higher end or lower end of the scale, you still get more. There's more people that will receive access.
You say that, and this is exactly what Doug Ford wants people to think. They're like, well, we're benefiting more people, but if you give them less money, they can't afford to take that step into school. It's like they can't do it. Like, sure, you're going to give them like this much money, but they need an extra like so and so grand left, and they can't just grab that. They're going to have to wait. They're going to have to take time off. They're going to have to change their career paths. I just think that we're in a society now where we understand that education is important. And one of the issues is that university is publicly owned, and that's not something that the government can control. And I get that. But it just seems very hypocritical for them to take the stance on open for business and then cut off education to half of the province.
Again, from a business perspective and from the province's perspective, they're looking at the education budget, which is by far the largest one in this province next to healthcare. And because much of it is publicly funded and OSAP is funded, they're looking at, all right, well, these are the two kind of money pits that we're dumping our money into. And where can we look to at least at the same time attempt to provide more options for more people while at the same time limiting the overall budget that we're using here? And by turning low-income students into potential revenue opportunities by providing more options for more students, and while that may limit some students,
debt for more students,
not
more options, more debt for more students.
Well, debt is a revenue generator for the province,
not for the student,
which is unfortunate. I will admit. But again, looking at this from the province's perspective, that's why they're doing.
Why are you looking at it from the province's perspective?
Well, the province, as
why are you taking the whole few people that don't care about this and taking it from their perspective? You were a student, your kids will go to school. That affects you more than what the province thinks.
Well, leaving that aside, looking at it from the province's perspective, because the province itself is in a significant amount of debt at the moment, over 15. It's used to be 15 billion. It's actually less than that now. Due to the efforts of the government, it is less than that now. But the problem is, their biggest expense is currently paying off interest for that debt, which is another several $billion. And we are going to be saddled with that debt in taxes going further on. And I'd rather that we kind of face the hardship now rather than face the hardship later when it not necessarily be you and I dealing with it, but children that are not even born yet will be saddled with that burden and potentially crash a whole system that has been benefiting us so far.
You say that, right? But I understand that the province is in debt, but there are multiple ways that you can change this. There are multiple ways that you can fix this. And to hit education the hardest seems very counterintuitive, because if you want, your province to grow and prosper in business, a lot of these people need an education. You don't have to agree with whether or not university is the right step, but a lot of businesses now ask for university educations, in order for more businesses to grow and more people to be hired and more people to do this and this and that, education is a key component to that. That's what it is. So if you want to be more economical, education isn't the way to cut it. There are more places that you can target first. And the thing is that Ford is targeting stuff now, but his first sin was, I'm going to cut education.
Well, I don't disagree. Although you could also look at it as university isn't the only education benefiter out there.
Yes, but university is still needed. That's not the argument that we're having today.
University is not the only education distributor that exists. There are many ways that we could go learn the same things that we learn in university much more cost effectively and potentially receive an actual better education in return for any dollars spent than we would have actually having gone to university. For example, there are lots of online programs that exist. There's lots of other programs that exist. In many cases, and while it is true that many organizations still require bachelor's degrees in order to apply for certain programs, the number is actually going less. So the number is actually decreasing, the number of organizations which require bachelor's degrees, simply because there are so many fields out there which no longer require it, such as computer science, the industry which I am currently in. Bachelor's degrees are no longer necessary in order to be successful in that field.
They're necessary in a lot of other fields, though.
They still are. This is true.
We're not at the point where a university isn't necessary. As much as I want to be yeah, you can do whatever you want. A lot of people who want to do a lot of degrees, who want to do a lot of career paths, need degrees, doctors, or even stuff marketing, lawyers, even journalists. they ask for degrees. And
This is
I
true.
just personally think that we're not at that point yet, and you shouldn't force students to like give up on their dreams and go study in an apprenticeship because that's what their family can afford. You know what I mean? Like, we're at the point where we're ever growing and we're ever committed to prospering and building businesses. And Doug Ford is basically being like, hey, so all those people who are rich and can afford university, congratulations, come right in. Everybody else, maybe education isn't the right path for you. Like, we should be in a society where everybody's open to study what they want to study. And Doug Ford basically took that from the next generation.
I don't believe, and while you may believe this, I do not necessarily agree that university is the only means to education.
It isn't. But what I'm saying is that if you want to be,
and that if you truly wanted to pursue the dreams that you say people have, and which they do have, that because of these changes they are eliminated. How do I say this? They are eliminated. Finally, I don't know what better YouTube is, but that they in no way, shape, or form can pursue that. And I believe where there is a will, there is a way. And while it definitely may be more difficult, it is not impossible. And I believe that they took that into account.
I honestly, like, you can say that, but there are kids out there who want to get away from their hometown, who want to get away from their family. And the only way they can do that is if, you know, the government throws them a bone. They get that bone, they roll with it, they study, they achieve their dreams, and then they eventually give back to the province. Like, the government is limited that. You can say all you want that, like, if there's a will, there's a way. But if you're living in, I don't know, like, trying to think of, like, a really redneck boony area.
Brampton.
Yeah. Okay. And your parents, you know, like, this is a sad case. Your parents are lowlifes. Like, there are people out there, and all they want to do is grow. And if the government's like, hey, we're going to give you, like, this amount of money, but you're still going to be, like, this much short, you're stuck. And that shouldn't be a thing. Like, that's something that I don't want any student to go through. Like, OSAP is what got me into school and where I am today. And if I didn't have that, I would have studied at my hometown college.
And while those are a lot of great points, are they justified? I suppose that is not for us to decide. But you can certainly help us decide on which point or which point of view you agree with. Do you support these changes? Do you not support these changes? And we will leave it to you to decide. I want to thank you for joining us on this segment of Debate Date. Certainly a heated one, certainly a passionate one, but we are all the more intelligent for discussing it. All decisions made in an open discourse benefit everybody who is a part of it, and in no way, shape, or form is anybody ever wrong, and there is nobody who is ever right, but there are merely the results at the end of the day that that provide the benefits that we want. And I'd like everybody,
so civil of you.
And I want everybody to realize that everybody is a winner and nobody is a loser when we take these problems and we discuss them openly, without judgment and without bias.
I just want to say that he made eye contact with me the entire time he said that. I don't judge you. I just disagree with you.
And I disagree with you, but that's okay because that is the power of open discourse.
I do get your point, and I understand the government has to do something. I just think they could have done it differently.
And I'd be happy to vote for you if you had a different plan that would benefit both the province and the students in the same way. And if you presented that, I would certainly vote for you. Vote Allysha for Premier 20. What is it? Not 20. It was 2018 was the election. So 4 years. 2022. Everybody.
Hashtag Allysha 2022.
Hashtag Allysha.
Oh, I would do such a better job than Doug Ford.
2022. Before we end.
We have some exciting news before you talk about your sponsor.
Okay.
Do you want to talk about where your sponsor will be this week? Yes.
So I own a company. It's called Groundhog. You may recognize it from all of the sponsorship advertisements. And we are headed to Collision Conference, the biggest tech conference to ever grace Toronto.
Which, in case you didn't know, is a pretty big deal.
Or the world, actually,
yeah,
for that matter.
Yeah.
Over 22,000 attendees from over 100 different countries. Out of 15,000 applicants to a competition that they host called Pitch, where 60 companies compete to have the ultimate pitch and seek investment money on a global stage. Groundhog, our company, was selected as one of 11 Toronto-based startups to represent Toronto in this competition out of 15,000 applicants.
So it's a pretty big deal, and you get to take the stage tomorrow.
Yes. So as of it's Monday today, and tomorrow will be Tuesday, and that's.
So I guess you'll be done by the time this is aired.
Yeah. So we'll already have pitched and hopefully have won. Yeah. We pitch, we win, we win, we go home.
That's the plan.
Yeah. That's the plan. And we're looking really forward to that. It's going to be a lot of fun. I've practiced my pitch. I've practiced my answers to potential investor questions, and hopefully the next time that I'm on this podcast, we'll have a nice little bit of investor money to continue operation and provide awesome digital marketing and sales products for the whole world.
Yeah, so congratulations to you.
Bit of a big deal.
It is a big deal, and obviously everybody wishes you luck.
Thank you.
It'll be great.
Speaking of big deals, Groundhog is our sponsor for this video, Groundhog Marketing Automation for WordPress. If you have a business, a small business, or if you're looking to start a business, or you're just looking to communicate with your followers or your tribe, if you're an Instagram influencer and you're looking to start building up a list, then Groundhog for WordPress is definitely the tool that you need.
If you're a podcast.
If you're a podcast, for example, we use Groundhog in order to collect registrations on our website, and that way we can send them emails every time a new podcast comes out. We can also send them text messages when we collect their phone number and say, hey, listen, the latest debate date came out about Doug Ford and his changes to OSAP. You should absolutely check it out and leave a comment in order to let us know what you think. We can absolutely do that. We can also segment based on who's listening to us, how long, where they come from. All of those things can be done with this tool. So go to groundhog.io, groundhog.io, and click the download now button. If you have a WordPress website, it's super easy to get started. If you don't have a WordPress website already, it's also easy to get started. Just download WordPress, get a website going. You can install Groundhog and start collecting email addresses and phone numbers to start marketing and communicating with your followers. Yeah. So thank you for joining us on this debate day. We will see you next week.
Cue the outro music.